Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Haley McNamara. All right, well, thank you so much. I'm so excited for today's conversation with Julie Inman Grant, and she is Australia's eSafety Commissioner. She's really a pioneer, leading the world's first government regulatory agency focused on keeping citizens safe online, which especially in the age of COVID, we realize is so important. It intersects with all of our lives. So thank you so much, Julie, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Haley.
I would love to maybe start off by hearing a bit about your personal background and maybe what the eSafety Commission is for those who aren't familiar with it.
Sure. Well, some of your audience may be confused as to why I don't have a lilting Australian accent. And that's because I was actually born in the US, and I got my start on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., working for my hometown congressman, who happened to represent a small little company called Microsoft. Wow. And this was in the early 1990s, before there was an internet. And so I really started working at the intersection of social policy and justice and the online world before there was an internet. And I joined Microsoft as one of their first government relations officials in Washington, D.C. back in 1995. Right when the internet was on the cusp, and so was involved in shaping the Communications Decency Act and Section 230, which is really in the spotlight now, because at the time there were very few players. Microsoft and AOL and Yahoo and Alta Vista and Netscape was coming on the scene. But social media wasn't a thing, and we were very concerned that the internet wouldn't reach its full potential if it were overregulated, and also helped shape things like the first White House summit on online safety under the Clinton administration. And then they sent me off to, after the antitrust trial, which again is bringing back a little bit of deja vu with everything we're seeing happening in Washington, D.C. They sent me off to Australia, where I've been for really the past 20 years. And so I had stints at Twitter and at Adobe. So I guess I'm a little bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper. When the eSafety Commissioner was established, it was initially the Children's eSafety Commissioner, and it was a fellow named Alistair McGibbon served that first 9 months. But they really wanted someone who understood the technology industry and understood what their true limitations were, but when they could do more. So they really did want a technology insider who understood these issues and was committed and passionate to them. And I guess that's what they got in me.
Well, absolutely. You are what a jack of all trades, so many different experiences. Why do you think in general something like an eSafety Commission is needed? Very often people, particularly those in the tech background, will say that self-regulation is fine, and there's still concerns about any kind of regulation. What do you think is the need for an eSafety Commission?
Yeah, well, my observation is company leadership and attention on online safety issues. And what I mean by that are really the personal harms that happen whenever you're building a platform that stimulates social interaction. So it is important to remember that these are humans interacting and human behavior is at play, which makes it particularly challenging. And, Communications Decency Act in 1995-96 was the perfect example that it was a hot issue. It was legislated around. About 5 or 10 years later, MySpace, really what led to MySpace's demise was the fear of pedophiles targeting young people on social media. We saw that again 10 years later in the UK when David Cameron was the Prime Minister at the time, and they really activated a focus on safety. I often felt like safety was the poor cousin to security and privacy, to be frank. And I brought the idea of safety by design to Microsoft about 10 years ago. And the leadership is different now, and the focus is different now, and they're, re-stepping up some of their important work in this area. But at the time, they said, we're never going to be a social media site. We're becoming an enterprise company. This isn't our issue. And I said, well, actually, it is our issue. We're dealing with consumers. Xbox is a toxic place. Skype is being misused for live streaming child sexual abuse material. Well, they've really fixed Xbox, and it's really a standout gold standard in terms of safety. Skype, not so much. So I think we all have a role to play here, and we need leadership. At the top of these companies, they've got access to the best intellectual capital, vast financial resources, advanced technical tools. If Jack Dorsey or Sundar Pichai or Mark Zuckerberg said to their teams tomorrow, we're going to fix these safety problems, we're going to fix cyberbullying, we're going to fix misinformation, we're going to really tackle child sexual exploitation, I think it could happen. We just haven't seen that kind of leadership and investment that we need to see to make a real change, and frankly, self-regulation has failed, which is why 6 years ago, our government said enough is enough. We want to take a pragmatic approach and a light touch approach, but we need a regulator to be removing seriously harmful content for our citizens. We need someone focused on prevention so the harms don't happen in the first place. And I guess really the flavor I brought in addition to protection and prevention was proactive and systemic change. We don't want to just be playing whack-a-mole. How do we minimize the threat surface for the future? How do we look at the new threats coming around immersive technology and decentralization and deep fakes? How do we actually shift the responsibility back onto the platforms through initiatives like Safety by Design?
Well, absolutely. And I love what you're saying, especially about being forward-looking and not playing whack-a-mole, because we'll sometimes do some advocacy with individual corporations and we can see great improvements happen, but then another person is starting up a new technology platform and often has to relearn those same problems or vulnerabilities kind of over and over again. You mentioned
it's that tech wreck moment,
yes.
And I don't think they have to be inevitable. Which is it's really telling. So I think there are two challenges here, which I'm sure you've identified. The first is there have been some really great technologies that exist out there. In fact, Microsoft and Professor Hani Farid developed photo DNA, which is still a foundational, really important technology that creates digital hashes and footprints so that known child sexual abuse images can be detected, across platforms across the internet. But when you look at the take-up, there's really only a handful of companies, maybe hundreds in a constellation of hundreds of thousands of technology companies that should be deploying these technologies. And then you do have so much variability in terms of knowledge of or commitment to online safety. And this is why we think safety by design is so important. Really what we're asking the companies to do is assess risk at the front end. What are the range of things that could go wrong, and how do we assess those risks and then build the protections in at the front end rather than embedding them after the damage has been done. So baking in rather than bolting on, which is done systematically for security and privacy. It just needs to be extended to safety. And so we've developed these interactive tools with industry, surfacing up a lot of the best practices. And we've done two sets of tools, one for startups so that it's really light touch. We want it to be educated. We know they're not going to have lots of staff and lots of time. So it will take anywhere from 1 hour to 7 hours. But it walks through what are the range of online harms, how is your platform likely to be weaponized, what does a business model canvas look like, and what are a few key things you can do to make your platform safer. Whereas the tool for mid-tier and enterprise companies is a lot more modular. There are 5 different modules, and it goes a lot deeper because we should expect more.
Yes, absolutely. And I love the approach too, because you're really working collaboratively in many of these cases with, these private companies. For the safety by design, are there certain key principles that, you hope any tech company would employ?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're so right, Haley. And, I know from my years in industry that government's not really going to be best placed to dictate what protections should be embedded. And of course, every platform is different. So I guess there's a voluntary nature to this. It's a form of self-regulation, but it's also a form of encouragement. You can either use the heavy stick, or you can, catch more flies with honey, I think, and you can bring the industry along and do it with industry rather than to industry. Because to me, this is a cultural change program that has to happen, from moving fast and breaking things to moving more mindfully, still being able to get to market quickly, still being able to be innovative, but making sure that you're actually managing the regulatory, reputational, and revenue risks. So the 3 principles, we actually started with 4 sets of principles when we started sitting down with companies back in 2018. And they're now in 3 primary areas. And that took about 9 months because the consultation had to be meaningful and the principles had to be actionable and effective and achievable. So those 3 areas are service provider responsibility. So, the idea being that the task of safety should never fall upon the user. So what are the basic things that the companies need to be doing? User empowerment and technology. So there are a number of ethical and human rights frameworks that we brought to bear on this too, so that we are empowering users to largely control their own experiences, making sure that report abuse functionality is discoverable, it's easy to use, those types of things, that there are user empowerment technologies that are effective and work. And then the last area is in transparency and accountability. And there are, of course, a bunch of steps that come under that. But interestingly, what happened is we got a lot of the big companies to sign off on these, which was good, it was surprising, and I think it speaks to the process. But I think we all felt like principles are great, but people are experiencing a bit of principles fatigue. There are principles for this and there are principles for that. And we started to notice that there was sort of stovepiping of principles. So there's principles around violent extremism. There's the voluntary principles around child sexual abuse material. There are, there's this age-appropriate design code. So, what we wanted to say is, like, let's look at all these things. But if a company is assessing across the range of risks, that's going to lead to better outcomes. So it's kind of a broad tent type of approach. So let's capture all the risks at once. So that's where the whole idea around the tools came around, and not wanting to be punitive or name and shame or punish, but actually surface up best practice. So if you go through our tools, you'll see lots of great videos from Facebook and Google and Yubo and Snap and Twitch. So they really were all in and wanted to share the innovations that they were doing. This is an area where I remember talking about co-opetition, where the companies compete on a number of things, but this is an area where we really need to cooperate on and learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, are there ever times when you're going back to companies and telling them that they're not living up to the principles, or are you mostly focusing on trying to create that kind of positive peer pressure but between the companies for people to live up to the principles?
Well, I mean, there are complex pieces of this puzzle, and I would say that my role as a regulator is a delicate dance at times,
Yeah.
because I do have some pretty potent powers that I can use, and sometimes we need to use those when companies don't comply, and we also have a range of powers to target perpetrators, find them, and the like. We've just had a new set of reforms pass the parliament, and they'll be implemented shortly. So while safety by design is voluntary and it's designed to obviously lift the safety standards across the industry to help ensure that companies are doing the basics and they're complying, they're not directly tied to our legislative powers. So a couple of useful things for us in the fight against child sexual abuse in particular. So we've modernized our online content scheme, which has been in place for more than 20 years through this process, which is really important. This gives us extraterritorial powers, so that we can compel takedown of harmful or illegal material wherever it's hosted. And that's good because the vast majority, 99.9% of the child sexual abuse material and pro-terrorist content we see is not hosted in Australia, it's hosted elsewhere. And that's why we're a part, while this global collaboration is important, we're part of InHope network, and that's how we enable a lot of the takedowns. We obviously work very closely with law enforcement in Australia, but overseas, and we're part of groups like the Child Dignity Alliance and the We Protect Global Alliance as well, because all of this needs to happen globally. And really, all of us suffer when there are countries that don't have robust laws that or enforcement mechanisms and that enable child sexual abuse to really grow and prosper. So this is why we do need to be global. But this also allows us to regulate for youth-based cyberbullying, adult cyber abuse, and what we call image-based abuse, which is the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and videos. About 30% of the reports we get into our office are from young people under the age of 18. So it does become child sexual abuse. A lot of sexual extortion that we're seeing, a lot of what we call relationship retribution, upskirting, downblousing, a range of different scenarios. But the threat to share can be very menacing. And a lot of perpetrators using fake or imposter accounts, to meet young people in particular, to get them to do that sexy Skype. And the minute that happens, they're either extorting them for more explicit images or sex acts for money with the threat to share. So very, very menacing for anyone, but particularly for a young person. So one of the other provisions is around, so these powers will extend to not just social media, but to dating sites and online gaming platforms. Will be able to issue link deletion notices to search engines. Will be able to compel the app stores like the iTunes Store and Google Play to remove rogue apps that aren't complying with their terms of service. So very comprehensive. Content needs to be taken down within 24 hours. And then we have a new set of rules around basic online safety expectations. So it's like a duty of care or a license to operate in Australia. You have to be living up to these basic expectations to keep your users and our citizens safer. And we'll be able to compel transparency reports and really also to discover whether companies are actually enforcing their own policies consistently and fairly. Also sort of surfacing up what are the trends that we're seeing and how are you dealing with some of these wicked problems like anonymity as an identity shield in facilitating abuse. How do you prevent what we call recidivism or bad actors who maybe targeting multiple people or creating multiple accounts? If you suspend their accounts, what kind of signals are you looking for to prevent them from rejoining and reoffending, frankly?
I am loving how comprehensive all of this is and in the approach, because I think especially making sure that policies are actually being enforced, that's something that we constantly see being a problem with many tech companies that we're doing advocacy with, and the approach with image-based abuse, which as exactly as you said, it's a rising problem. And I think it's very cutting edge to already be looking at that proactively and providing some tools and support to address that problem. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of really great NGOs that are doing work in this space. The Revenge Porn Hotline in the UK, CCRI in the US. By the way, we don't call it revenge porn. One of the first things that I did as commissioner said, and when we set up this regulatory scheme, was we're not going to call it revenge porn. Revenge for what?
Yeah.
That's inherently victim blaming. It's not always porn for the prurient interest. So we thought, let's call it what it is, image-based abuse. And it's taken a few years, but the lexicon is starting to catch on, like it did 10 or 15 years ago around calling child sexual abuse material kiddie porn, which trivialized what it was. It's not like these children who are being tortured and abused have any agency in their abuse. So the lexicon matters. We have about an 85% success rate in terms of getting intimate images and videos down from thousands of sites all over the world. So having that government seal behind you, we can find end users up to $100,000 in content hosts, up to $500,000 for not taking the content down. We can force a range of remedial actions. So we can do informal notices, formal notices. We can force them to make an apology, remove the content, delete the content. So, and what's interesting is these civil powers are really important because so many citizens come to us, they've gone to the police first. There are criminal provisions there, but of course, police have a range of different crimes that they need to prioritize and triage on. So they'll often kind of get the, like, can't you just get off the internet? Or why did you do this in the first place? And these victims and survivors don't want to go through the criminal justice system. Often these people are known to them. Going to court is time consuming and it's expensive, and they often have to bring their images up in trial. So they like coming to eSafety because we take a citizen service approach, and even so sometimes we have people come to us with 400 URLs.
Wow.
So we're taking down multiple images and videos, but we're also providing wraparound support. If they need legal assistance, we'll send them to legal aid. If they need mental health assistance, which they often do because it's a very distressing thing to have happen, we can provide that and refer them there, and if necessary, refer them to law enforcement, particularly if there's a fear of physical harm.
It's so cutting edge. I mean, it's something that I really hope that in hopefully 5 years, hopefully it doesn't take 10 years, we see this kind of thing being normal throughout the world. Because I know I've talked with so many survivors in the US, in the UK, where I'm living now, and other places as well, where there's really nothing they can do when their image-based abuse materials are showing up in searches or are showing up on different websites. And very often, I think because in so many other countries, those individuals just have to reach out to the company directly. They don't have the intermediary of a government office. It gets lost, and sometimes nothing happens, or maybe takes months for that kind of material to be taken down, which causes so much additional trauma as well. So I'm so glad to know that Australia is leading the way on this too.
Well, thank you. And if you're living in the UK, you know that they're considering an online safety bill, and we've been, talking and working with Ofcom. They're taking a slightly different approach. They're going to have some really significant, hard-hitting powers, which is exciting. They won't be offering kind of the direct citizen service that we provide. Ireland's setting up theirs. I'm actually speaking to the Irish Parliament next week because they're trying to consider, do we do that citizen-facing service, or do we just look at systems and processes? Talking to the Canadians, we had a talk with the White House Gender Policy Council last week. We're talking to Korea and Singapore. Fiji has an online safety commissioner. So I think your prediction is right. I suspect in the next 5 years, we will have a network of online safety commissioners, just like there are data protection authorities around the world. And I think it's necessary. And, we're trying to build as much capacity so that people can learn from our mistakes, to make sure that we're on the same trajectory. So we're not creating a global splinter net that then perpetrators and companies can game for their own uses.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's so encouraging to know that this is being perpetuated and being worked on around the world. Switching gears a little bit, I know there's the idea of user or consumer age verification for online pornography websites. And this is an idea that's been floated and been tested out, had various levels of support around the world, often a solid amount of support. I'd be curious if you could maybe give an overview of where Australia stands on that issue.
Oh, sure. One of the first tasks I took on board in 2017 was to set up an expert panel, a multi-sectoral panel, to look at how do we protect children from harmful exposure to pornography. And to believe it or not, when I was at Microsoft back in 2008, we tried to run one of the first age verification pilots here in Australia, but it was really too early. The ecosystem wasn't there yet, and I think the ecosystem, frankly, is still evolving. So we saw, what I learned, in terms of what I often say to parents these days is, the pornography that's readily accessible to your kids right now is not the penthouse that your dad, hid in his sock drawer. This is increasingly violent, increasingly extreme, because that's what's selling, and it's giving potentially a whole generation a skewed view about what a respectful, loving relationship or what a sexual relationship should look like, because kids are using online porn as a de facto sex education mechanism. So, so we looked at age verification as one potential kind of technology ecosystem approach, but we know it needs to be multi-pronged. There needs to be cultural change. There needs to be education in the schools. There needs to be education of teachers. We all remember the subjects in school where our teachers felt comfortable and were really empowered to talk about things. And, that's not happening. But where we are here in Australia is we watched very closely what was happening in the UK. The BBFC was very generous in terms of sharing what they experienced. I spent some time in the UK in 2018 talking to all of the stakeholders. And of course, we know that kind of imploded. And, I think one of the lessons there was that the issue wasn't looked at holistically and in terms of balancing the ecosystem with security, privacy, and safety. And the public wasn't necessarily brought along either. So we've been tasked by our government to put forward a policy and regulatory roadmap to look at age verification. We think it's going to take a good 12 months to get all these right. And we've done some preliminary research that sort of shows us that there's very, very low knowledge amongst the general populace about what age verification or age assurance or age gating is, and what the difference is, and how that ties into digital identity. So we do need to take people on a journey, but there's no question we need to do something to protect young prying eyes from, either inadvertently or deliberately coming across content that could be really harmful and change their whole understanding of what respectful relationships look like.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that your assessment is so key for others in other countries who might be looking at age verification. Those two challenges and things to address of making sure that privacy concerns are addressed, very important, of course. And also, yeah, that the public is brought along. It isn't something that's done too quickly or without any education about, I think, both what age verification is, and I think also the importance of the impact of pornography exposure for children, I think is important. Most people intuitively recognize that it has some harms, but of course there's been so much research that's very helpful for people to see. My last question for you would be if you have any advice to those who work with or within other countries' governments. Maybe they're listening to this and they're inspired. Maybe their country doesn't have anything like an eSafety commission, but they'd like to pursue being more proactive about addressing these problems online. Do you have any advice for them?
Sure. Well, please look at esafety.gov.au. We now actually have an international capacity building team, and which was set up to build capacity and capability and share more around our model. We welcome more countries coming on board. We continue to want to work with more companies and more NGOs. So a starting point for many companies or countries would be to join an alliance like the We Protect Global Alliance. They're working on the next version of the Model National Response and the Global Strategic Response. But I guess because it is such a ecosystem question, we all have a role to play. We all need to lift our standards. We all need to do better as individuals, as parents, as families, as companies, as NGOs and activists, and certainly as governments. So getting involved in these debates, building partnerships, understanding where we all have a role to play, we're not all going to be well placed to play the same kinds of roles. So understanding how that works, but I would encourage more governments to look at this model. We think the model of prevention with that's evidence-based and focuses on identifying risks without using fear-based messages and judgment and finger wagging, so that we can really enable behavioral change and making sure that that's audience-based, providing the protection by taking down seriously harmful content, and then holding those to account, whether they're companies or perpetrators themselves, for hosting this content, and then really trying to get ahead of technology trends and understand how technologies can be harnessed for the benefits and to fight this scourge, but also understanding how technology can be misused. And trying to get ahead of that, and like I said, bake in rather than bolt on safety protections. I think that'll put us in really good stead.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, we'll be linking to your website, and I encourage people to go there, see your resources, learn, and hopefully within 5 years we'll have another event talking about how the world is so much different and so much better for online safety. Great, thank you.
We can only hope.